some of the made-up stuff.
Speaker.
Ian McKelvie.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm not going to say the name of the bill because it's so long it would take the first couple of minutes of my speech. But as a taxpayer of long standing, probably of the longest standing of any taxpayer in the House at the moment, I think I need to comment on a couple of comments by the opposition. Firstly, on the last one, Gareth Hughes often makes very measured speeches. He talked a lot of nonsense in the first minute of that one. But I also want to pick up a couple of points Michael Wood made in respect to the speech of the Honourable Amy Adams. And he talked about being ideologically opposed to tax, and then went on to criticise the National Party or the opposition for its lack of care and whatever else. Well, I think that's a gross misstatement on his behalf, and we certainly aren't opposed to tax and people paying their share of their or taking their responsibility in respect to paying tax. I think that was an offensive thing to say, and particularly to the Honourable Amy Adams, who is, of course, our finance spokesperson. I think that was quite unnecessary. I want to talk about the bill in the fact that it's a fair and it's an unfair bill, so you could rename it, in fact, the Fair and Unfair Bill. And there's some parts of this bill which I think are eminently fair and do some very good things. One of them is the fact that we're trying to even the playing field a little bit with respect to tax on imports or on, as Mr Bailey called it, the Amazon tax. I think that's a very good system. It's trying to level the playing field with respect to our retailers and the ability to import things without paying GST. If we can get to the post with that, and perhaps even in due course get it to a lower level than it currently has been able to be set, it'd be wonderful. But of course that's an international issue and a very complicated one. But I do think that's a very fair part of this tax bill, and I think it's well worthwhile. Now I want to talk about a couple of things that I think are unfair, and I think it is the ideological difference between the two sides of the House. That is that we think people are better at spending the money themselves, and the government clearly think that they're better at spending our money for us. And that always will be an ideological debate, and one that's worth having at all times. And so I agree with Mr Hughes on that point, that we certainly do need to have a debate on the sensible and the unsensible bits of this discussion, because it is a major difference between, I guess, the National Party and the government. And the other thing I want to talk about very briefly is the rental losses situation. And the reason I want to raise it is because it's really a sign of a government interfering, or, well, you could say it's a government interfering in a process to try and alter behaviour. Now, the problem with that, and we've seen it many times in the past in New Zealand, where you get involved in trying to influence behaviour, you sometimes influence that behaviour in a negative manner. And when you think about the tax or the changes to this taxation around rental losses, it could have the impact of distorting the market, and not in the manner that the government intends. We don't know that, but it also could have the impact or an impact on changing the investment market in New Zealand. Now, that might not necessarily be for the better. So it is dangerous for governments to get involved in this kind of, I guess, singling out an area for different treatment than another area, because it will change the behaviour of investors. I think that our rental market in New Zealand has been very well served by landlords. And the other thing, of course, when you start to put pressure on landlords, it makes it very difficult for them to upgrade their properties in the manner that they clearly need to in some cases. And so I think we've got to be careful how we manage that part of the thing. The other thing I want to talk briefly about, because it's only a very small part of this bill, but becomes part of every taxation bill that the House considers, is the changes to the IRD. And the changes they're making, I think they're great if they work. The challenge we've got with the IRD, with some of the changes to the IRD, or two I want to identify very quickly. One is that there's hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders going to suddenly be required to correspond with the IRD in one form or another who have never had any association with the IRD before. And I've got great concerns about that, because I think it'll be intimidating for people. People will not grasp that very easily, and I think that's going to be a great challenge for the IRD to ensure that they are able to where they do need to transact with those people, that they do it in a manner that those people can get a grip on, because I think that is a concern. The other thing that I think is also of great concern, and particularly in rural New Zealand, is that a lot of this transaction's done through the internet and through technology. And that is very challenging for some parts of New Zealand still, and very challenging for a demographic, or for the demographic that I come from, interestingly, the kind of over 65s. A lot of us have challenges with that. So there's a few things that I don't think are entirely good. So, Mr. Speaker, that's my contribution. I think it's kind of unfair in some ways, this bill, and it's grossly unfair in others. Thank you.
This is a split call, 5 minutes. I call Willow Jean Prime.